Welcome back, everybody. In this video, I am going to give you 3 practical tips to employ for when you are in a losing position. When we're in a losing position, we're not just going to let our opponent out easy. We're not just going to give them an easy out. We're going to make them work for it, make them fight, make them earn that win. These 3 tips are going to help you do that, so let's jump into it. The first practical tip I have for you for when you are in a losing position is to keep pieces on the board. In general, the more pieces you trade off, the easier it's going to be for the player who has the winning position to close the game out and get the actual win. Instead, do your best to keep pieces on the board so that you can keep attacking chances and you can keep fighting. In this position, I had the black pieces here and I'm up a pawn, so I'm more than happy to trade pieces off and get pieces off the board, lead towards a winning endgame. So here I played queen d8. This is a good move because we have some pressure between the queens. If we trade off queens, I'm happy. We move closer to an endgame. And additionally, I have got the absolute control of the d file here. White did not cooperate with me and trade queens. I would have been very happy if that happened. I would have recaptured with the rook. But instead, the better move, practically and according to the engine, is queen c1 or even queen d2. White needs to keep the queen on the board here. If you can keep the queen on the board when you're in this losing position, you're going to keep the position a little bit more complex and you're going to increase your chances to actually be able to hold a draw or maybe even swindle your opponent and grab the win. So keep pieces on the board when you're in a losing position. Think about it when you're in a winning position. You feel a great sigh of relief when you can get a piece traded off because you think, oh, this is one fewer headache I have to worry about. On the flip side, keep pieces on the board when you're in a losing position. This is going to help your chances a lot. As another example for keeping pieces on the board, another thing you're going to want to look out for is knight forks, specifically moves where the knight attacks 2 different pieces at the same time. It doesn't even have to be pieces of greater value. Just any kind of knight fork can be a problem. So in this position, I had the black pieces, and here my opponent played the move b4. This was not the best move because it allows knight d5. With this move, notice that I'm up a pawn already, so I'm happy to trade off pieces. Knight d5 is a great move because it attacks 2 different pieces. This means no matter what, a piece is coming off the board. If white captures my piece, I'll be able to recapture with the pawn. We've just taken a piece off the board. I'm happy with that. And instead, if either one of these pieces moves, I'll be able to capture the other with my knight. Again, we're getting a piece off the board. So be aware of these knight forks. If you are in a losing position like white is here, white probably should not have played b4, which allows this knight fork. Instead, probably would have been better to play knight a4. Now after knight d5, you can just play bishop d4. You can keep pieces on the board, keep the position a little bit more complex. But notice that this goes both ways. When you're in a losing position, you want to try to avoid these knight forks, but as you saw the way I played, I'm in the winning position. So I'm always looking for these knight forks so that I can attack 2 pieces. I can find instances where I can absolutely force pieces off the board. Knight fork is one of these great examples. The second practical tip I have for you when you're in a losing position is to play the tricky move. Opt for the sharp move that leads down the tactical variation. This is going to give you better practical chances at winning or getting the draw because they hinge on your opponent seeing the actual tactical line and selecting the correct move. If they choose the wrong one, you can probably win a piece and you can beat them on the tactic. So in this position, I had the white pieces here and I'm up 3 points of material. Doing very, very well here. And in this position, I played bishop d1. Now, the best move, according to the engine, is rook g7. But instead, my opponent played rook h4. Now, this sets up a trap. If we capture this rook here, now black is going to have the move rook g8 check. Notice that the king cannot go to h1 because that's going to be checkmate. So the only move that actually staves off mate is queen g2. We have to sacrifice our queen here, but black is actually not going to take the queen. Instead, they're going to play the beautiful move queen f4. Now, queen h2 is actually going to be checkmate on the next move if we allow it because the queen on g2 cannot capture because it's pinned by the rook. We're up 8 points of material here, but black is absolutely crushing. The engine says it is negative 36. So black found a very, very tricky move. Luckily, I saw this line, so I didn't actually capture the rook, but he set up a very sharp tactic and forced me to play very precisely to be able to hold this win. Instead, I played rook takes a6. We're up 4 points of material, But my opponent did not let up. He continued to play very sharp moves, trying to lead me down tactical positions, because if I didn't find the right move, I might have lost the game. I might have gotten checkmated. So here my opponent played queen g5, adding some pressure to the king, pinning this pawn, and also setting up maybe a potential sacrifice with the bishop. Here I played rook a7 check. After the king moved to f6, I played queen f3 check. Honestly, I was a little nervous because there was a lot of pressure around my king, so I wanted to bring the queen back and try to consolidate as much as I could. Now my opponent played bishop f4. Now this, again, is not the best move, but practically it's very interesting. I felt like there was a lot of pressure in this position. So here I played queen g2, just trying to solidify everything, make sure that there aren't going to be any sacrifices later in the future. And now my opponent played rook g8. Again, my opponent is trying to build more pressure against my king. He's looking for the sharp moves that lead down these very tactical variations, because if I make the wrong move, if I overlook one thing, I might just get checkmated here. Notice that I cannot capture this bishop on f4 because the rook or the queen could recapture. This pawn would not be able to recapture because it's going to be pinned. So there is actually a lot of pressure in this position. We see as white that we feel like we should be completely winning. We're up 4 points of material, but there's actually a lot of pressure. So the best move here is rook e1, but even now there's still queen f5, and now black has the threat of playing queen h3 check, forcing the king to g1. There is a lot of pressure in this position. Luckily, I was able to hold it together. I was able to stop all the threats and still get the win, but my opponent really made me work for it. Would have been much easier if he just allowed me to trade off pieces, if he just played very simple, solid chess. That would have been much easier for me. But he made a very smart move, and he decided to go for very sharp moves to try to lead me down a tactical variation. And I'm not going to lie, I was very stressed during this game because I knew I should be completely winning, but I also knew that I had to be very precise here because he was building up a lot of attacking ideas on the king side. So for the second tip, play the sharp move, lead down the tactical variation if you're losing, because you were going to force your opponent to play very precisely. Even if it's not the best move, sometimes it's just going to give you the best practical chances at getting a desirable outcome. I've touched on that second tip before in a previous video on how to improve at blitz chess, so I'll link it now. Check it out if you want to. But otherwise, the third and final practical tip I have for you when you're in a losing position is to try to force your opponent into a drawish endgame. So specifically, an opposite colored bishop endgame or a rook endgame. Both of these are notoriously very drawish. Sometimes with opposite colored bishop endgames, your opponent could be up 2, maybe even 3 pawns at times, and it can still be a draw. So let's look at our example here. So in this example, black is up 2 extra points of material. They have a b pawn, they also have an f pawn, which we don't have, so they certainly have the advantage. But this endgame actually should be a draw because of the move bishop takes e5 check. Now after black recaptures, we've got an opposite colored bishop endgame, and even though black is up 2 extra pawns, what we're going to be able to do is control the light squares with the bishop and the king such that these 2 passed pawns will not be able to promote. So we can play bishop f3 here. And now after bishop a5 check, we're going to move our king. So we're really stopping. We're controlling this e4 square. We're stopping the pawn on e5. Now black is going to try to create a passed pawn, but we can play something like bishop d1 here. We're going to want to get the bishop to this diagonal. So if we can get this bishop on the diagonal, the black pawn is not going to be able to do much. If black plays king c5, trying to promote this b pawn, we can play bishop g4. And if black ever pushes, now we can get the bishop to this diagonal. Once the bishop is on this diagonal, it's going to be very difficult to push this pawn. If the king tries to run this way, then we can check on these light squares, force the king away. This pawn is not going to be able to promote. And instead, if black tries to go for king b4, then we're going to attack this pawn. And you'll see that this pawn is not going to be able to make progress. The black king cannot go to a4 because that pins the pawn. The pawn would not be able to push at all. And if the king goes back to c5, then we go back to our original idea with bishop e6, keeping the bishop on this diagonal. Instead, if black tries to play something like bishop b6 to try to move the king this way to then be able to promote, then we're going to just play bishop e8, keep pressure on this pawn, and after king a5, now we tuck the bishop right back to its key diagonal, controlling all of these light squares. If black plays b4, we've got bishop b3, and we have completed an absolute blockade on the light squares. Neither one of these passed pawns is going to be able to promote, and instead, obviously, if the king comes back to b4, we're just going to go back to e8. We just repeat the same idea. So this is a fantastic idea of leading towards drawish endgames. You can see our opponent was up 2 full points of material, 2 full pawns, but we found a way to force them into a drawish endgame to be able to hold the draw and get ourselves out of that losing position. Opposite colored bishop endgames are notoriously drawish, so try to lead your opponent into those endgames if you can when you're in a losing position. But also rook endgames are as well. So if you see an opportunity to get into a rook endgame, that too can give you very, very good drawing chances and help you get out of that losing position to get a favorable outcome. As a quick recap, the 3 practical tips when you are in a losing position are: first, keep pieces on the board. This keeps the position a little bit more complex, forces your opponent to really grind you down to get their win. Second, opt for the tricky move. Try to find sharp variations because this is going to force your opponent to be very, very precise to get their win. And third, finally, try to lead towards opposite colored bishop endgames or rook endgames. If you can lead towards one of these two, generally more drawish endgames, this is going to give you better practical chances to avoid a loss. If you enjoyed this video and you found it useful, then please give it a thumbs up and also consider subscribing.